So okay, I have the green light. Okay, I get started. So this is the real hardcore here. We started at 9 o'clock this morning. Nice to see so many of you still in the room. For those of you who weren't here this morning, my name is Mettler, and I'm the head of the European Political Strategy Center, the Commission's, European Commission's in-house think tank. So welcome back, everyone, to this session, which is now entitled, "What if winter were coming? Is Europe prepared for the security challenges to come?" And if one issue, I would say, has really literally exploded on the European policy scene in recent years, it's certainly security. Whether it is sort of the traditional, conventional threats or the emergence of new ones, such as the proliferation of low-cost terrorism, targeted at civilians, or the spread of cyber attacks disrupting our critical infrastructures, or the use of disinformation and propaganda as a weapon of war. And I think it's fair to say that we are living in a completely new security environment. Now, our speakers will dissect for us what might be the key external and internal security challenges that the European Union and maybe also the world will face in the coming decade, including new security frontiers such as privacy and data, which was already mentioned several times today, including by the colleagues from the OECD this morning. Now, I don't want to say much more because I'm of course here to listen to our very distinguished guests and our wonderful panel. They've each been given 5 to 7 minutes to lay out really their perspective on future security challenges and the trends that they see emerge. Now, let me first call on the man to my right here, who is without a doubt responsible for what is really the world's most important security conference. It's, of course, the Munich Security Conference. And Ambassador Wolfgang Ischinger, without a doubt, one of the most important and prolific diplomats that Germany has ever seen, now in charge of this very important conference. Ambassador, great you can be with us, and over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Anne. It's always a pleasure to be back in Brussels, even if it's only for a few hours for me today. The headline in the program was, "What if winter were coming? And is Europe prepared for the security challenges to come?" Well, quite frankly, winter is coming. It's approaching fast, and in a number of respects. And I'll use my 5 or 7 minutes to talk about this in some greater detail. But is Europe prepared for the security challenges to come? The answer to that question has to be a categorical no. I would argue we have actually made a little bit of progress. Certainly a lot more progress than in the 10 years past, because there was practically zero progress for a long time. Things have started to move, and this is why this is such an interesting and challenging issue. But let me just make a 30-second advertisement, if I may, because I don't know how many other Germans have spoken here today. What happens in Berlin at the moment is that winter is also coming to Berlin and to Germany, but it is not the end of the world. And we will have, I want to just make sure you all understand this, we will have, at the end of the day, we don't know what day that will be, an essentially pro-European government, probably led by well-known Angela Merkel. What kind of coalition will emerge is at this moment unclear. I just want to make sure that people don't get overly dramatic about this. It's not a crisis of the German state. It's not a constitutional crisis. We have all sorts of constitutional arrangements, including a possibility of a minority government, including actually new elections, if nothing else works. So don't count Berlin out as a future factor of stability in terms of the European overall effort to keep things under control and to develop the European Union forward. I just wanted to make sure that's said. Now, Europeans, I quote, Europeans must take greater responsibility for their security. That's what the European Council said a year ago. One of last year's most important understatements, because I think I would choose far more dramatic words than that. Carl Bildt sits in row number 2 here, right in front of me, and he correctly spoke some time ago of the ring of fire which has emerged around the European Union. As we look at the ring of fire in the east, in the south, in the southeast, we have to acknowledge that our military capabilities are depleted. Our inventories have reached a critical low level across most weapon systems in most European member countries. Our most important ally on the other side of the Atlantic has expressed his or her or their willingness to reduce their involvement in European security in a number of ways. Remember Chancellor Merkel's rather unusually frank remark when she said the times in which we could completely depend on others are to a certain extent over, it seems. And finally, I think defense and defense policy have a great opportunity to become, more popular. We have these polls which seem to indicate that 75% of Europeans favor a more common, more integrated European defense effort. So it may be true that throughout the European Union, the EU is seen more as part of the problem than as part of the EU, but most Europeans, large majorities of Europeans, believe that if Europe can offer more, it should offer more and probably can offer more in the area of defense and security. So what needs to be done? Final 2 minutes. You will be able to read a long report which we, the Munich Security Conference, are going to publish in just a few days' time. It will be highlighted in the upcoming edition of Der Spiegel, so those of you who can read German can already read it this weekend. We need more European pooling and sharing. We need more European, more connected, and more capable defense forces, that's clear, and there is a clearly defined way how to do that. But finally, I just want to make the point for purposes of our discussion. Even if most members of the EU also happen to be members of NATO, even if we were to meet the famous 2% goal, that would still not mean that we would be seen as a respectable, capable, and unified player by the rest of the world. I think what we need to talk about is the very painful, for many, very painful question of decision-making about foreign policy and security in the European Union. What about qualified majority voting? I know that many will shake their heads and will say that is a question of sovereignty and we don't even want to talk about it. Let me remind you that when and this is my last sentence, when I was political director in the German Foreign Ministry, the second half of the 90s, we had reached a point where we were almost willing to propose with our French and British colleagues an initiative to introduce qualified majority voting in the European Union. If we want to be a respected player in Beijing, in Moscow, in Washington, and elsewhere, building defense forces is necessary but not sufficient. thinking about foreign policy decision-making is the one important thing that needs to be addressed, and that's a discussion we need to start. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, and very grateful that you brought in the aspect of defense, which many of you know is a top priority of President Juncker. And I think it's fair to say that given the pressure that we also feel, the concern that people have for their security, more has been done on defense probably in the last 6 months than is fair to say in the last 60 years or so. So that sense of urgency is there. However, you know, one might argue that many of the contemporary threats would not be met through traditional military means. And that's actually then perhaps the perfect segue to the man on my left, Rob Wainwright, Executive Director of Europol. Rob, under your leadership and your stewardship, really, Europol has become very much an anchor, the anchor of European security policy. You have initiated the creation of important new units, such as the European Cybercrime Center, the European Counterterrorism Center, and most recently, and for obvious reasons, the European Migrant Smuggling Center. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Anne. So let me touch on the internal security aspects and how they are shaping our new geopolitical order. Well, we all see the manifestations of the terrorist and criminal threat around Europe. The scale is clearly rising. The level of complexity is rising. In the last 3 years, of course, sadly, hundreds of our citizens have died in terrorist attacks around Europe, including in this very city, of course. And in this year alone, 23 major terrorist incidents already. But a level of complexity indicated by the way in which the threat is propagated by a very large community of thousands of radicalized individuals in very many different countries, among which you have the possibility of the next lone wolf attacker who can hire a truck, as we saw in Paris, in Berlin, in the UK, and many other locations, and kill very many people. A migration threat, a migration challenge, a crisis indeed for Europe over the last 3 years, again, at the heart of which a fundamental underpinning element has been the way in which enterprising criminal groups have exploited the plight of the migrants and refugees that have flown to Europe in increasing numbers. According to Europol's work, 90%, up to 90% of all those that have come, at least across the southern Mediterranean area, have had their journey facilitated by a criminal organization. And then, of course, the scale and complexity of cyber threats all the time increasing. The famous WannaCry ransomware epidemic earlier this year affecting 260,000 companies around the world. When Europol, FBI, Dutch services and a number of others in Europe took out the 2 largest dark marketplaces operating on the darknet earlier this year, these were, between them, trading in 350,000 different illicit commodities. You can go online to the dark market and literally buy any commodity in almost any quantity from the illicit market. Drugs, firearms, stolen identities, child sexual abuse material, and so on. An enormous underground criminal economy that is propping up there for this explosion in the internal security threats that we face. That has profound implications for our businesses and our citizens, but it also has implications in geopolitical terms for the interests of the European Union as a whole. The combination of the challenges from migration and terrorism over the last 3 years have really shaped the political scene in Europe, as we know, and even raised questions about the future of the Schengen zone, for example. We had and continue to have real debate about that. That is a geopolitical interest directly challenged by an internal security threat. It's shaped the way in which our foreign policy interests, especially towards Turkey and those countries in the Middle East and North Africa as well. On cybercrime, we're talking about threats almost existential in nature to the integrity of the financial system, to our critical national infrastructure in many other countries. This is high-level, very important geopolitical interests of the European Union. And to understand the dimension of the threat that's beyond it, we have to see how it operates in a much more globalized context. There's clearly a global impact. WannaCry affected companies in 150 countries, for example. We have an organized crime scene in Europe, formed of around 5,000 groups. coming from 180 different nationalities. We have a foreign terrorist fighter scene of thousands of European and indeed other nationals flocking to Syria and Iraq in the last 5 years, again from most of our countries in Europe and indeed beyond. We have a level of sophistication that's increasing. Again, WannaCry was important because it's the first ransomware attack that we saw that was self-propagating, had a built-in worm functionality. And that's a clever move by the criminals, and that's why it spread around the world like wildfire and dominated the news cycle for 72 hours. We had a terrorist attack in Barcelona, very, very significant, in the ability of a cell, this time not having been trained and sent back from Syria and Iraq, but within our community, a cell of 12 people who have virtually stayed completely off the radar in a country in Spain that knows a lot about how to counter terrorism. They were smart enough to learn the lessons from the mistakes of their predecessors, especially in terms of how they communicated in their planning for that attack. What I'm describing, especially in terms of the use of technology and mobility and other conditions of globalization, is a different kind of threat which challenges our internal security. And the challenges that means for law enforcement is that, and our society as a whole, is that we have to do more to build our resilience, especially to face these threats. Now, there's a lot of public policy debate on that, a lot of legislation in the counter-terrorist space that's important in this area. On cybercrime, it's resilience in our industries. It's a mindset, a culture issue. It's about taking it more seriously. It's about making sure we don't take silly mistakes. WannaCry only worked, a very simple, actually, technology behind that attack that affected so many companies because they had very, very low cybersecurity standards. They weren't even getting the basics right, and that included many, many global multinationals. In the last day, we've heard about this breach in Uber and some crazy decisions that this very leading-edge technology company made at the time in terms of how to respond to that. Not good enough. Resilience and capability and culture in industry is not good enough. We need resilience more importantly than a compliance methodology. What I mean by that are lessons from trying to counter the flows of terrorist financing, especially money laundering in the banking system, has resulted in the creation of an enormous anti-money laundering regime that costs $8.2 billion to run in each of the global banks around the world. An enormous regime in which the compliance of certain regulatory standards has become an end in itself. You must check every transaction according to A to Z, and if you don't, we'll fine you. And the result of being compliant, it has become the end in itself, not the impact that that has on actually catching bad money. And that means that an enormous effort, heavily regulated, has only resulted in 1% of all the criminal revenues in Europe, for example, being seized. A 1% return of investment on that massive program. A wrong mindset. We need to change the way in which we approach these much more dynamic threats. We need to have a much greater international response, not one just rooted also at the national level. And of course, we have to use data in a more enterprising way to fix some of the intelligence sharing challenges that we have. That's how the geopolitical security order looks like in Europe at the moment. That's why institutions like Europol have been formed and have developed in the last 8 years in order that we can do something more with data in a much more enterprising way to see how cross-border criminality and terrorism works, so that we can support more high-level international operations, and that we can respond to this in a much more modern and flexible way, which is what is required. Thank you, Anna.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rob. What's so interesting, really throughout the day, but also in your remarks, is the very heavy emphasis on technology. And it was actually, in the previous session, we talked about connectivity as something that's good and leads to economic development. But the flip side of that, of course, is that connectivity also can make you very vulnerable. I mean, you talk about the WannaCry attack and many others. So, so perhaps connectivity also as a game changer, not just for geopolitics, but also for the security environment. And since you spoke so much about technology, it's the perfect segue to our last speaker in this round, Rob Leslie, founder and CEO of Sedicii Innovation and co-founder of Kyckr. So Rob, if I understood correctly, much of your work focuses on how to protect people's privacy and personal information, and cybersecurity obviously is a huge issue. I mean, we just heard about this, but there are also so many connected issues, whether it's online espionage, cyberbullying, and really the weaponization of social media. So it'd be very interesting to get more sort of a private sector perspective on that and how you view this. So over to you.
Great. Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here. Listening to what Rob was saying there, you'd be terrified to think that the world is functioning sort of normally, given the amount of cybercrime, money laundering, terrorist financing activity that's going on. This morning we heard about big data, we heard about AI, and when Jonathan asked the question earlier, who in the room has built a mobile app, and I was the last man standing on that side of the room, I got a little bit nervous. But I am an engineer, and my sort of sole role in life is about solving problems. And the problem that we have in the world at the moment is that we have very little digital trust. And this is what we're focused on, how to create trust in the world between organizations and between people. If you look at what's happened in terms of data leakage, and maybe leakage is the wrong word, it's a flood at this stage over the last period of time. For the first half of 2016, it was roughly 500 million records had leaked. For the first half of 2017, it had almost quadrupled to 2 billion records. Now that is a phenomenal number, and I would almost put a bet on it that at least half the people in this room have been affected, but you do not know it. You will have had a record, an email address, or a password stolen from somewhere that you've long forgotten about. And this is one of the things that we looked at trying to address. Personally, I have no idea where my information resides. I've long lost track of it all. But the crooks know where to go to get it, and they know how to sell it, and they know how to make money from it. And this information is highly valuable. It's 57 million records that Uber lost last year, and they paid 100,000 euros to ask the crooks to erase it. If I was a crook, I'd take the 100 grand and I'd still go and sell it. I wouldn't erase it at all. And that probably is what happened. It's just naive beyond belief. So when we started looking at technological solutions to this problem, we started to think about, what do we need to do to protect our own privacy, our identity, our data online? Because the scale of the problem is so big that we cannot rely on law enforcement to address every single one of them. We have to have a capability to look after ourselves. And if you think about what you do today when you register information, you will have bits of who you are all over the place, from banks to retailers to government agencies, utilities, hospitals, it's everywhere. I don't know how many places my identity exists, probably somewhere in the 5,000 to 10,000 range. At a guess, between places I've registered once, bought something, and I will never go back again, but they have my information there, and it doesn't go out of date. Well, it does go out of date, but it persists forever. So this is one of the things that we need a solution for. How do I come up with a mechanism to be able to see who has my information? Today, it's one-way traffic. I need to know who has it, and I need to know whether it is true or false, meaning has it gone out of date in the meantime? Have I changed my name? Have I moved house? All of these things that are dynamic in nature that don't stand still. I want to be able to see where my digital footprint extends to. And I want technology to help me do that so that I can see into government agencies, closed databases where my information exists. And I want to see if it's right. If it's not right, I want the means to be able to ask the organization to refresh it. If it's wrong and you shouldn't have it, I want the ability to be able to tell you to delete it. But if I don't know it's there to start with, that becomes extremely difficult. So some of the technologies that we've been working on are the ability to compare information in closed databases without the need to expose the information itself. So from a privacy perspective, I'm still able to keep everything private, but get visibility into the trust level around the information itself. Is what my version of the truth matching what others have about me? Now, Rob talked about a money laundering regime that cost banks billions. Today, it relies essentially on paper documents. If I could take those paper documents and convert them into a digital process, where I could verify that the data that is in those documents is true, and if it changes for whatever reason, I get a notification to say, Rob's passport's expired, or his driving license has changed, or his ID card is now defunct. Suddenly, we've got real-time information that is driving a process rather than something that is static and way behind in terms of time when you need to get information. In the previous panel, we were talking about an airline scenario in terms of connectivity. This is one that we're doing a little bit of work on at the moment in the UK. How to identify a passenger before they arrive at the airport so that I know who to expect, and I've pre-screened him or her, and I know they're not a risk, and I'm happy to let them go through the green channel all the way to their plane. Today, everybody's treated exactly the same, whether you're really good or really bad. And that's not fit for purpose in a digital age. So what we're looking to do, again, is rely on government agencies who've got best-in-class information to be able to make that information available to those who need to get it. Airlines, airports, trains, border control, visas, whoever. So they're getting this real-time information that they can use to make decisions, automated decisions in many cases. The last thing I will say is housekeeping. Data is accumulating at a phenomenal rate. Some of you will remember this movie, The Sixth Sense, where the kid says, I see dead people. Well, one of the things that we look at is we look for dead companies that still exist in cyberspace because they are money launderers' dream. If you can identify them and notify the authorities or whoever you need to do, you are now cleaning up a potential problem that has existed for a long time. Another thing that we do, we join dots. So if I was buying something online, you know, I did a demonstration in Ishpal, actually, buying Viagra online just for demonstration purposes, and I picked a company and at random, and we went through, let's see where this company resides, let's see where the money flow goes to, let's see where the phone number's linked to, and lo and behold, this was an enterprise spread out all over the world, and the guy who was running it had an enforcement action out against him in Hong Kong for some kind of illegal activity in relation to cigarettes. I wouldn't have bought it if I'd known that anything, I wasn't going to buy it anyway, but I wouldn't have bought it had I known this information. And again, this is how we can use technology today to join information that is out there, that's just not available in a form that we can readily use. So these are some of the things that I think we can use technology and data to really bring trust to the ecosystem.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rob. I think it's very interesting. But just a quick follow-up comment and question to all of you. I mean, what you describe here, that system, would in principle only work if the companies or the organizations would agree to be part in it, right? I mean, so, because I was just thinking, to give an example, recently I bought a dress online with an American company, and 3 weeks later I get a package from China. So sure enough, whatever data I've given an American company in good faith has now been transferred to China. My address, my credit card details, probably my phone number. So my point is, many companies would have no incentive to sort of be part of it because the lack of privacy facilitates many things, and these are the good guys. We're not even talking about criminals, huh? So how much of an issue is sort of the fact that the internet is international and global by definition, but our governance systems are really, frankly, not equipped to deal with that? I mean, you must face that all the time. I'm going to call Rob Wainwright Rob 1 and you Rob 2, but Rob 1, you must encounter this all the time. In the preparatory discussion, we talked about a cybercrime. I said, well, what's a cybercrime? It's essentially a crime that almost certainly will go unpunished. Isn't that true? Someone does something wrong in China. What are you going to do about it, Rob? Rob 1.
Yeah, of course, because we have the internet that acts in a way that provides terrific opportunities for criminals and terrorists. Of course, to protect their identity and to use just the principle of anonymity that we all enjoy and our freedom in using the internet every day, plus ever more powerful encryption methods to protect their identity, protect their communications with others. And I briefly mentioned a reference to the darknet earlier that allows them to operate in a way which is normally beyond the view and control of law enforcement. So we have a problem of attribution. We can't even attribute the crime, let alone go further in the investigation of it. Once we've attributed it in those cases in which we can, next is the problem of jurisdictional access. How do we seek these people who are in jurisdictions that are outside our effective control or range of law enforcement cooperation with international partners? It's fair to say that the majority of cyber criminal activity that impacts on the European Union is propagated by Russian-speaking criminal groups. So immediately we have issues of cooperation and having those that jurisdictional access. So for law enforcement, that means, you know, instead of moaning about it and putting our arms up in the world and thinking this is a pessimistic outlook, we just have to be smarter. We have to find alternative ways, actually going back to more traditional ways of working against criminal and terrorist groups, using informants more often, for example. And there is a space for doing that even in the cyber age, in combination with the work that we're doing. And we're learning how to do that. And the result in taking down the 2 largest dark marketplaces shows that it is capable sometime. We are capable, if we unite our capabilities across different countries, to even go after the hardest criminal groups. So it is possible. It's just challenging every day.
Absolutely, I believe that. I mean, go to you, Ambassador. I was recently at the Web Summit in Lisbon, and for those of you that don't know, it's the largest technology conference in the world, 60,000 people, usually sort of really a very happy atmosphere, and this year it was very different. I mean, there was a lot of concern about essentially where the world is heading, and a lot of anxiety around especially disinformation. But the point I want to make to you is one of the talks that I attended was how to prevent a cyber war. And the speaker here made the point that essentially in all conflicts between nations, the internet and cyber plays a key role, but that essentially the traditional military apparatus or so is very poorly equipped to deal with this, starting really with the lack of expertise in military itself to deal with it, and even understanding sort of the scope of what we're talking about here. So any thoughts on that? Because you've been observing this for a long time. I mean, what do you see?
I think this is really an exciting and extremely challenging new set of questions that you are raising here. One of the immediate and easy to understand consequences has to be for our governments in the national security, of course also in the homeland security area that you guys are thinking about, but in the national security or international security area, we need to encourage our countries individually and collectively to spend hugely more money on defense R&D. At this moment, the percentage is less than 4% in the EU. 4. I believe very strongly that a better number would be 15 or 20, because we don't really need, the next generation of classic cannon that may also be useful for some purposes, but we need to do exactly what you said. We need to prepare our defense establishment to deal with cyber-based threats. So that's obvious, it will lead to major changes in the allocation of resources. It will lead to a whole new ballgame, because the cyber industry, the smart kids, are to be found not in the classic arms industry. They come from very different areas of industry and business and development. So there's a new convergence here, possibly, hopefully. First remark. Second remark. Cyber requires us to rethink the role of the nation state, and I would claim the following is probably true. Cyber is beginning to act as the great equalizer, not only between nations, because it allows potentially a very, classically speaking, a very weak nation, a small nation with practically zero military capability, to inflict major damage on some other nation, if it so desires. Maybe even hoping that it will not be detected. In other words, that a reprisal or revenge action may not happen, because this can be done under stealth conditions, possibly. The second, and maybe even more important aspect, is that cyber acts as an equalizer between the nation state and non-state actors. When our grandfathers, or fathers to some extent, were involved in military conflict, speaking of Europeans, it was almost exclusively in the 19th or even in the 20th century, conflict between nation states. If you look at the long list of conflicts at the present, at the end of 2017, it's very hard to find a single conflict that looks like a classic nation-state against nation-state conflict. It's almost all kind of civil war situations, conflicts within nation-states, where the Taliban fight the other Afghans, and where the Sunni fights the Shia faction in various other countries. You know what I'm talking about. And what cyber does is it actually raises a question about the validity of the classic argument that is the nation state that requests and demands for itself the monopoly of the use of force. All of a sudden, you have guys out there, not only the Islamic State, but very different groups, criminal groups and others, who can, even though they are not even a nation state, who can inflict so much damage against individuals, against companies, against institutions, or against nations, that quite frankly, if you take the argument even further, you could say we have to rethink international law, to the extent that it was based, the Charter of the United Nations, based on nation state A against nation state B. How do we regulate that, their behavior? We need to rethink international law in terms of the relationship between the classic nation state, which still exists and will continue to exist, and non-state actors who are going to possess ever-increasing powers to influence others by threatening to inflict damage, or even by inflicting damage. So it's a whole new, brave new world out there.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you so much. I mean, my team here, we've done a lot of work on what we call the defense security nexus, because we think that one really cannot distinguish anymore what you're saying about the military aspect, the traditional ways, and more the homeland security, the interior. So, I mean, it poses a lot of questions, not just to intellectually do that, but also do it in practice, because the military world is not necessarily used to dealing with people like you, Rob one. So,
can I, before you
go ahead.
Can I just, offer just a 20-second anecdote? When we started in the context of the Munich Security Conference, where you have a classic audience of diplomats, political decision makers, parliamentarians, generals. When we started some 5 or 6 years ago to introduce, in the context of our agenda, cyber, I was frightened. I was, terrified that when the cyber agenda was going to be put on stage, my audience would go and have coffee. The exact opposite has happened. When we have cyber, some of you have been to Munich, when we have cyber issues on the agenda, people actually stay in the room. Even though they later then confess, I only understood half of it, but I understand that this is important for me. Even if I'm a classic general commanding a battalion or whatever, divisions, they understand that the influence of cyber is going to be accelerating so dramatically that they have no choice. They have to understand it. They have to invest more money, which is, again, I think a key point. Our militaries need to consider cyber just in the same manner as half a century ago, space was considered the new ball game for, at least for countries that had technological capabilities. And cyber is the new frontier.
Yeah, Rob one,
calling from space. I think, of course, it challenges all the sort of stereotypical, traditional assumptions we have about what is national security, what is defense, what is homeland security, as Wolfgang calls it. Of course, we have now cyber threats that are becoming intertwined between state actors and non-state actors. Clear footprints of state involvement, state actor involvement in some of the major cyber criminal activity. That's going to drive up levels of capability in a much broader base. For example, in terrorism, what we see for the first time, we've been talking about it for 20 years, about the crime-terrorism nexus. Not a lot of evidence for that, frankly, despite the sort of hoo-ha that's created over the last few years, until now. The typical profile of the IS fighter and the person who's radicalized in Europe these days in our streets has a much greater criminal connection than ever before. A criminal background from a broken family, a drugs culture maybe, and somebody who might still be in contact with criminals. What that means is we have to gear our response in a different way, take it out of the comfort zone of the traditional national security intelligence world and blend it much more with a much broader set of police databases in order that we can capture as much information and much knowledge about these people before they do us great harm. And on terrorism, it challenges the assumptions of what it means for national security. In Europe 30 years ago, 40 years ago, more recently, terrorism really defined by the way in which groups such as the IRA, groups such as ETA, really threatened the territorial integrity of certain countries. Clearly a national security issue. We're talking about the sovereignty, the territorial integrity of a country. That's clearly national security. ISIS or Al-Qaeda don't threaten the territorial integrity of any of our countries. They operate in a very different way. It raises really interesting questions about what is national security anymore, at least in the terrorism space. And it also, of course, highlights a great public policy paradox that we have, that terrorism today is defined by its international nature, and yet our response to it is led overwhelmingly at the national level. It's a red line issue here in the European Union. It's a national security issue. It shall be the sole competence, not even the lead competence, the sole competence of member states. And so we've geared our response, traditionally and still today, around the fact that this is very much a national-led focus, and yet the problem is international in nature. There's a reality gap, therefore. That's not to say, by the way, we should give different levels of competence to the EU. I'm not arguing for that at all, but a recognition that you have to mitigate for the effects of that reality gap as the world around us is changing and as the implications of that are seen by us every day in the cyber and terrorism world. So yes, I think there are much broader issues of strategic and geopolitical importance here that affect policymakers, politicians, and law enforcement intelligence chiefs.
Very good, thank you. Before we open up, just a quick question to Rob too, because I mean, what you described, sort of the privacy angle, to many people that will be very attractive, but it's actually maybe people like Rob1 that say, I actually would like to have access to a lot of this data. No, I mean, doesn't sort of the law enforcement, they would actually like to have access to a lot of the data that traditionally now is owned by companies, you know, and is no longer in the public domain. Who are your clients? I mean, are they mostly, is it companies that come to you and say, I want to provide a better service, or is it also governments or state actors that are interested?
Today, our biggest customers are banks, because they spend a phenomenal amount of money trying to verify who their customers are. And some of the commercial models, I think you asked earlier, Anne, about what's the incentive for companies to want to get involved in this. If you've got quality data, you can sell that data and you can make money from it. I mean, we did some analysis with the Passport Office, for example, in the UK. And we reckoned there's a £500 million revenue stream that the Passport Office could create just by providing verifications to the private sector when identity documents are presented. So every bank, every car hire company, every airline, every airport, every real estate agent, every lawyer, every accountant, every transaction that I do with one of those groups, I have to verify who I am. And today it's done by the presentation of a paper document which is scanned, photocopied, and put in a file never to be seen again, and a tick in the box that says it's been done. Frankly, it's not fit for purpose. The passport started life 600 years ago, when King John gave his emissary a piece of paper to say, let this man pass to France to deliver a letter to the King of France. And we fundamentally haven't really changed a whole lot. Yet our whole world today is about digital systems. And yet these systems do not talk to each other properly. So one of the things that we want the consumer to do is to help align their identity so that it is consistent in the places it needs to be. That means my bank will know who I am, and then my bank can link to my telco can link to my government, we can link to my airline, and can link to law enforcement, and all of these things come back together.
Rob, can I ask a quick follow-up question? Because what you describe is banks having an obligation to know their customer. There is now, especially around fake news, a very vibrant debate whether platforms should also have an obligation to know their customers, because so obviously they don't. I was just saying in the preparatory discussion, if you're Facebook and you're paid in ruble for an ad that runs in the United States, maybe you should be asking some questions. Obviously, you didn't know your customer. So my question is this perhaps a way to get a grip on this issue? Because if it works for banks, why wouldn't it work for others?
Most definitely. And, you know, Bitcoin and cryptocurrency is another area that we're going to have to get a grip on. Today, it's essentially anonymous, although there are ways and means to figure out who is the owner of a particular address in a cryptocurrency wallet. But the Holy Grail really is creating pseudonymity, which is knowing that a person who is acting as somebody in a social media platform can actually be linked to a verified and trusted identity through traditional legal means. So if you want to know who somebody is on Twitter or Facebook or whatever, I can go to a court and the court can say, find out who this person is, and I can link it back to an identity. Today, as you point out, that doesn't exist in many cases.
So, Rob1, what do you do then in such a case? There's a criminal on Facebook. There's someone who's posing to be someone they're not. What can you do?
Well, we try to engage with social media platform providers to help us as much as possible, of course, but it operates, and they do. I mean, part of Europol's response to terrorism is to concert the law enforcement community's engagement with industry to identify and remove terrorist content online, and we're doing that in tens of thousands of cases, and the largest social media companies are very productive with us, and we have no enforcement powers at all. This is just a meeting of minds, shared interest, and generally a constructive attitude from most of those companies, not all of them. The problem is it operates in a vacuum. We rely on our meeting their minds in that way, and there is no effective regulatory mechanism, of course, that compels, as you say, providers to do what banks are compelled to do in the anti-money laundering space. And that's because some of the principles, the way in which the internet was designed in the early years, one of the principles was that the providers of internet-based services shall not be liable and responsible for who uses them and the content thereupon. And that's a major principle that meant that the internet has evolved in a way which is in a very different space, therefore, than the banking industry. Should it be? Well, maybe not, because it gives rise to this great inconsistency that in our democratic societies we've legislated for the fact that we can compel banks to give information to law enforcement, but we've not done that for, say, online, for cryptocurrencies or those that operate in the darknet space. We've legislated for the fact that the police, under certain conditions and according to judicial supervision, can intercept telephone calls, but we have not done that when those communications are taking place via the medium of the internet. So if nothing else, there's a great inconsistency in the rationale and logic that as a society we're applying to this. It's simply the randomness of whether or not the terrorist uses a WhatsApp message or a mobile phone call as to whether or not the police might have the opportunity to stop him from carrying out that attack. That's not right. Now, the answer to that, of course, is very challenging because of the technological differences, significant differences in the internet space. But what I object to is this idea in some quarters that the internet should be the only part of our lives, indeed, where there is absolute privacy for its users. That's not right.
Very good. There's time for a few questions, comments. I see Nick Gowing here in the front. Please, here in front. And then the second mic can already go to Kurt de Boeuf over here. And
Thank you, Anne.
Introduce yourself.
Yeah,
please.
Nick Gowing, co-author Thinking the Unthinkable. Let me pick up from the title and what Ambassador Ischinger said. Winter is approaching and it's approaching fast, and what you've both said as well. The next bit is ... So what do we tell the kids? And what I'm therefore introducing into this debate is, how public do you make this sense of real threat, existential threat to societal stability? I've witnessed a lot of these discussions behind closed doors. A lot of politicians simply do not want to go there. They don't want to talk in Berlin about many of the threats that NATO is facing and the German involvement. In Britain, the same thing is happening. And I've heard politicians say, no, we cannot worry the public about this. Yet it is an existential threat, potentially, given what you're warning about, whether it be money or survivability within a house or within the system you're working within. And therefore, I put to you that the challenge, the conundrum, how much do politicians get involved in this and start telling publicly what it's about and what the threat is?
The Eurobarometer, which is a sentiment of what Europeans are worried about, number one is security and organized crime, very fast on the rise. So, I mean, people are worried about it. Do you have the mic? Go ahead.
I'm Kyckr from the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. I have a question for Rob Wainwright about ISIS. So since a few months, ISIS is losing ground, as we know, in Syria and Iraq. 1 month ago, they said that they want to move from state back to insurgency. At the same time, we see that Al-Qaeda is resurging, and a battle is starting between Al-Qaeda and ISIS, at least in the Middle East. So my question is, I mean, how much of what is happening there do you see reflecting, one, in cyberspace, two, financing, three, I mean, daily threats? I mean, and this fight between Al-Qaeda and ISIS, is this something that is coming to Europe? Or do you think like it's nothing to worry about so far?
Very good. Look forward to that answer, Rob one. Okay, so the lady over here. Fight between ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Whoa.
Okay, so I think it was the presentation by Rob too. It just made me think about the leakage of certain papers, for example, like the Panama Papers and recently the Paradise Papers as well, and how that was handled by the media and in general, how equipped we are to handle when somebody is sitting on that kind of information. How can they feel a certain responsibility towards taxpayers and citizens to bring that information out? But also what struck me was, in a way, how the media were assuming that everyone that was mentioned there was automatically kind of guilty of something, and confronting these people, whereas I could see situations where some were just following others, you know. So I just wondered about how
Can you
this
also
could be
introduce
handled
yourself?
better. Oh yes, I'm Jennifer Harper from Malta.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Then we had the lady over here, and please introduce yourself, and then I think we'll go back to our panel.
I'm Ramona Gaber from the YTN part of ESPAS. I want to come back to the question that Anne asked, how do we prevent a cyber war? And everybody who comes from the security community knows the deterrence factor of capabilities. And connected to that, we know that, or at least there have been rumors that China has a cyber strategy and they intend to train 500,000 cyber experts until 2027. Japan intends to train 50,000 by their Summer Olympic in Tokyo. In the same time, what are we doing? During this year's European Cybersecurity Conference, Romania won the second place, and I was wondering, I mean, it's anecdotal, but I was wondering what happens to these kids who are our cybersecurity experts. And I checked a few days later in the Romanian media, and 9 out of 10 have already received contracts, job offers from the private sector. This is not to say that them working in the private sector doesn't help for us to improve our cyber resilience, but I cannot help but thinking that there could be better ways for us to use them. So I think the question is, are we again lagging behind, and how do we ensure political buy-in to catch up?
Very good question, thank you. So, who wants to go first? Ambassador. How do we close the skills gap in the military establishment?
If I may, I'll
outside?
start with the last question. I think it's a very interesting question. You are absolutely right. The people, the young people, the trained experts in Europe that we have currently are not enough. They are there are far too few of them to cover the needs of the private sector, and more importantly, to cover the needs of the public sector. The public sector has obviously the additional problem that in most of our countries, the public sector can't pay these younger experts at the level they will be paid in the private sector. So here's just one solution. And this will be also in the report that we are publishing in a few days. I think that one way of moving this forward would be at the national level, but also maybe at the EU level, to create something that looks and smells a little bit like what the Americans have had for many years, what they call DARPA. Now, I'm of course coming from the defense and foreign policy area. If we had an agency, either at the EU level or at the national level, that would not just be a classic, ministry where you have to, where you can only pay your normal, government employee pay, but where you would have a greater room of maneuver. I think that focusing on R&D in cyber and making sure that the European Union will not fall behind even more than we seem to be falling behind already, I think would be a major venture for the entire European Union. Quite frankly, I think that many of our countries who've been who used to be rather sleepy about this, have recently woken up. I can only share with you that in my own country, in Germany, which came late in the defense area, which came late to the game, now, at this moment, last year, if I only look at research, the university which is funded by the German Armed Forces has just created 15 new professorial positions in one sweeping decisions. The problem is, how do you fill these positions? How do you find the qualified professors who will be able to do what they're expected to do? So I think this is a hugely important area. Can I also say one word about the question of how we deal with these threats and challenges in the public domain? Your question. I think we need to be far more open and transparent about this. I think the public not only deserves to understand what these challenges are, and we need to make them far more transparent. I am deeply disappointed, for example, that in my own country, we had, as you all know, we had an election campaign, we had elections in September. Neither before the elections, during the campaign, nor post-elections, during the discussions or negotiations about how to form a government, any of these issues that we're discussing here, including classic questions of national security and foreign policy and European Union issues, played any significant role. Germany seemed to be preoccupied with the questions of the kindergarten and the school and social benefits, etc., which I think I don't want to go into overdrive here, but I think this is almost a danger to national security, that people don't seem to be confronted by the political leadership with these fast evolving challenges, both in the homeland security area, by cyber, and in the international security area. Final sentence. I hope the first thing European citizens and kids will learn is that it is an unnatural state of play. It is not healthy to consider that Europe as a whole should be able to outsource significant elements of our collective security to a country that is on the other side of the Atlantic, and that used to be much more wealthy and much more powerful than we. But where is the pride of Europe representing 500 million people? We are actually more in terms of numbers than the Americans, and we are also not so stupid. So, and we've actually grown rather rich over the last several decades. So I think there's also a kind of a question of determination, of willpower, and of pride. And I think that's been lacking. 20 years ago, the European Union was, as an institution, represented when we tried to resolve crises. The European Union played a major role in the Iranian negotiations. But this year, in 2017, I would like to ask the question, where is the EU on Syria? At best, we play a marginal role, if we play a role at all. Where is the EU as a body representing 500 million people on Ukraine? And where is the EU on a number of other issues? I think we have a lot of catching up to do also in that sense.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I think you've given us a lot to think about. Let me say...
answer some of the questions then?
Yeah, absolutely, with great pleasure. And especially also this, what he was talking about, the dependence on technology that is essentially not European.
So
as
I
well.
think going to Nick Going's point about how honest we should be with the public, I'm a great believer in not treating the public as kids, and you have to respect them. They're not stupid. We live in an age of transparency. We should be transparent and make sure that they properly understand, are properly informed by the nature of the threat. Of course, we have to do it in a balanced and objective way, that we don't scaremonger, of course. But I think in order to make them as fully informed possible, so they make their own decisions about how to be safe online, how to be safe in other parts of their lives, I think we should inform them. There's also an issue about, I think, ethics in the public space and also in private industry. You know, we should encourage a debate I think, in our public life in which companies are taking responsibility also for their actions in keeping data safe, for example. The question about ISIS versus Al-Qaeda, the Great Championship playoff, we don't see that kind of battle in the financial space or in Europe right now. I think there are different groups. They do, to a certain extent, compete. There is some evidence of that, as you say, in the region at the moment. I think we are concerned about, over the period of ISIS's rise and now fall, Al-Qaeda has always been there, is still there, and retains a capability that is maybe more long-term and strategic in nature than ISIS, and will be still here, I think, in the future after ISIS has declined. In any event, there will be another iteration of the international jihadist threat in the future that we'll have to deal with, that will evolve from what we've seen in the last couple of years. I agree with Wolfgang's view on data science, effectively, and having an agency maybe in the European Union level that can exploit data in a better way. This is what's really driven Europol's development over the last 8 years. Our ability to collect data from multiple sources, 1,000 agencies now on our data sharing platform, to collect it at scale, to apply very modern techniques of data science, and analytical capability, and from that, to use data to drive a different kind of response to cross-border crime and terrorism. I'm a big believer in the data network effect that has spurred on the huge growth of companies like Amazon, trying to do the same now in the law enforcement space, and it works. Believe me, it works. But I agree with the point that Wolfgang was hinting at, that in Europe we don't have a Silicon Valley, we don't have the same tech industry, we don't have the same pioneering spirit, and yet we should have that. And we should have it also that operates in a way that supports the public sector, not just the private sector. I'm very pleased to say, by the way, we have Romanian analysts as part of our cybercrime capability, so at least some of them are coming to the good side as well. My final point is, I've almost made it to the very end of a conference, and it's a refreshing change, without one person saying the word Brexit. Thank you very much.
Well, it's not over yet. Rob, too, please, whatever you do, don't mention the word. Okay, over to you with a request for a very brief answer.
Just a couple of things. Security by design is one of the things that we need to look at. We're going to see an explosion of IoT devices, so sensors everywhere, in everything, listening to all kinds of stuff. And today there are very few standards, if any, that apply to these things. You can design a product, build it, and put it out there, and someone will use it. And these are a disaster waiting to happen. So we need standards around IoT-enabled devices that set minimum requirements for certain things. I'm terrified of Alexa in my home, for example, listening to stuff. I just don't want it. Keep it far, far away. Apps in my phone listening to stuff. These are the kind of things that I think the public actually needs to know about. And they need a resource that they can go to and just look it up if it was there. The other thing that I think is really important is education for kids. I don't think we do enough in relation to educating kids and teaching them about the perils of technology. I see my 12-year-old daughter, and she's stuck in her phone or her iPad, and all she's getting is the immediate gratification of whatever it is. Has no clue of what is being collected about her, her browsing habits, all of that stuff that is going to follow her around for the rest of her life. Just in relation to the Paradise Papers, I sort of felt sorry for the people in the Paradise Papers a little bit. Morally, they didn't do maybe the right thing, many of them, but legally, they did nothing wrong. And this is something that I think we've got to get on top of. Everybody is now free to comment and libel or slander somebody somewhere on the internet, and they think it's fair game. Our legal structures have got to catch up with this somehow, and we've got to get something that's fit for purpose that says there's a penalty if you breach a law that damages somebody's reputation in some way when it is not true. And I think that's really important.
Excellent. I mean, we could go on and on. It's so wonderful, this discussion, because it was Nick Gowing who said this is a top citizen's concern, and I completely agree. We see it in our everyday work. Of course, this is an issue, I said in the beginning, an exploding issue, really, in public policy, because you just cannot close your eyes. I mean, this is happening as we speak, even if politicians sometimes are scared to go there. Now, I think our panel has done a great job of shedding light on a lot of the issues, and I think they now deserve a very warm round of applause.